Chapter 321. Veilric. Veilric leaned back against his obsidian throne, his sharp gaze fixed on the broken woman before him. The room was dim, the torches casting flickering shadows that danced across the jagged walls. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by his quiet, mocking laughter. PLAP. PLAP. In the darkness, a silhouette of someone could be seen jumping up and down. Veilric moved closer, his shadow looming over her. His hand reached out, tracing the curve of her jaw with a mockery of gentleness. Such beauty wasted on weakness, he murmured, his tone almost wistful. You could have been so much more. Instead, you're nothing but a tool now, a broken one at that. He crouched before her, tilting her face upward so their eyes met. For a moment, his expression softened, not with kindness, but with twisted satisfaction. He was in control. Here, in this moment, nothing could challenge him. But then, snap. Veilric's head jerked up, his expression shifting instantly from smug to alert. Something was wrong. The air in the room had changed, carrying with it a faint hum of energy. His eyes narrowed as he focused, his senses sharpening. What? He muttered, his voice low and dangerous. His gaze darted around the chamber, searching for the source of the disturbance. The sensation grew stronger, a faint but unmistakable ripple of mana cutting through the oppressive air. It wasn't subtle, this was mana being used in significant amounts. Veilric's expression darkened. Mana, he said, his voice rising in disbelief. This isn't a disciple. This is far too strong. The energy pulsed again, sharper this time, like the beat of a war drum. Veilric's breath hitched as he recognized the signature. The intensity was unmistakable. This was mana at the level of a 3-star awakened, if not higher. An elder, Veilric hissed, his mind racing. But the possibility didn't sit right with him. No elder would unleash their mana like this without his explicit command. His orders had been clear, discipline above all else. His eyes widened as the realization hit him. Someone is attacking. In an instant, he was on his feet, his aura flaring as he surged with power. The oppressive force of his mana filled the chamber, the torches flickering wildly in response. His sharp gaze snapped to the woman before him, her lifeless expression unchanged. Out of my way, he growled, grabbing her bound form and throwing her aside like a rag doll. She landed heavily against the cold stone floor, unmoving. Veilric strode toward the door, his mind a storm of calculations and fury. If someone had breached his territory, if they dared to challenge the Crimson Serpent sect within its own stronghold, they would pay for their audacity in blood. Just then he sensed something. Swoosh! Veilric's hand shot to the hilt of his blade, drawing it in a single, fluid motion as his instincts screamed a warning. Clank! The clash echoed through the chamber as steel met steel, sparks flying from the force of the impact. Veilric's blade, a jagged, crimson-hued long sword, locked against the gleaming edge of another, a weapon shrouded in a faint, otherworldly glow. What? Veilric snarled, his sharp eyes narrowing as he pressed back against the force of the strike. His opponent had appeared out of nowhere, their presence masked until the last possible moment. The figure before him was cloaked in shadows, their face obscured by a hood that cast a veil of darkness over their features. But their stance, their precision spoke volumes. They were no mere intruder. Veilric gritted his teeth as he forced the opposing blade aside, his aura flaring with fury. Who dares to? But the figure didn't give him time to finish. They moved with inhuman speed, their blade darting toward him in a flurry of precise strikes. Clang! Clang! Veilric barely managed to deflect the rapid assault, his movements sharp but strained as he matched the intruder's speed. His teeth clenched in frustration. Whoever this was, they were no ordinary warrior. The sheer precision and ferocity of their strikes were unlike anything he'd encountered before. You'll regret this, Veilric hissed, his voice a low growl as he parried another attack and countered with a sweeping slash of his own. His crimson blade ignited with a dark, fiery glow, the power of his mana coursing through it as he aimed to overwhelm the intruder with sheer force. But the shadowed figure was undeterred. They twisted their body, narrowly avoiding the fiery arc of Veilric's blade, and retaliated with a spinning strike aimed at his side. Veilric blocked again, the clash sending a jarring vibration through his arms. His fury grew as he realized he was being pushed onto the defensive. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice echoing through the chamber. The figure tilted their heads slightly, their hood casting deeper shadows over their face, but the faint sound of a chuckle escaped from within. It was light, almost playful, yet it carried an undercurrent of mockery that cut through the tension like a knife. Who am I?" The figure mused aloud, their voice unmistakably young, perhaps belonging to someone in their early 20s. Despite its youthfulness, there was a sharpness to it, a taunting edge that made Veilric's teeth clench. "Does it matter?" the figure continued, their tone laced with teasing derision. They stepped forward, their blade shimmering with that same otherworldly glow. "You're going to die here after all, Veilric." The words hung in the air, each syllable dripping with confidence and contempt. Veilric's fiery aura flared in response, his anger boiling over as he glared at the shadowed figure. "You dare mock me?" Veilric snarled, his voice a low, venomous growl. "You think this is a game, boy? You'll regret every word." But the figure didn't flinch. Instead, they let out another soft laugh, the sound almost casual, as if Veilric's rage was nothing more than a passing amusement. "Oh, I'm counting on it," the young man replied, his blade shifting into a ready stance. The faint light surrounding it pulsed, the shadows in the room seeming to warp and dance around him. "Show me what the infamous Veilric can do." Surely, the Crimson Serpent sect's leader isn't all bark and no bite. Veilric's eyes burned with fury, his jagged blade igniting with a fiery blaze as he lunged forward. "You'll regret underestimating me." The figure met his charge head-on, their blades clashing in a violent explosion of sparks and mana. The room trembled under the weight of their auras, the oppressive heat of Veilric's fire battling against the eerie chill emanating from the figure's weapon. Clang! Clang! The strikes came fast and relentless, the two combatants moving in a deadly dance of steel and shadows. Veilric's strength and fiery fury were matched by the figure's agility and precision, their movements fluid and unyielding. "You talk big," Veilric growled between strikes, his blade arcing in a brutal slash. "But words won't save you." And yet, the figure countered, their voice calm and mocking as they sidestepped the attack. "Here I am, still standing." The exchange only fueled Veilric's rage, but there was a flicker of unease in his mind. The figure wasn't just taunting him, they were playing with him, every movement precise and deliberate, as if they were studying his every move. Veilric's mind raced, his sharp instincts screaming warnings that couldn't be ignored. He didn't know if there were others lurking in his stronghold, waiting to strike, but it didn't matter. No one would dare to strike the Crimson Serpent sect alone. This one must have allies, he thought grimly, his grip tightening on his jagged, crimson blade. "If I let this drag on, the consequences could be catastrophic. I need to end this now." His aura flared violently, the oppressive heat of his mana filling the chamber as he began channeling his energy. The crimson glow surrounding him darkened and intensified, coiling around his blade like a living entity. His lips curled into a vicious snarl as he uttered the name of his ultimate technique. Crimson Serpent Ascension. The air around him seemed to ignite as the energy coalesced into the form of a massive serpent, its body a writhing construct of molten flames and concentrated mana. The serpent's eyes glowed with a fiery menace, its fangs bared as it hissed, ready to strike. The figure before him didn't flinch. Instead, they tilted their heads slightly as if curious. "A big snake, is it?" they mused, their tone mocking despite the overwhelming pressure of Veilric's attack. How very fitting. Veilric's fury boiled over. With a roar, he surged forward, the serpent of flames coiling and striking in tandem with his blade. The room trembled under the force of the attack, the serpent's fiery maw snapping toward the shadowed figure with deadly precision. "Let's see you dodge this," Veilric bellowed, his voice filled with both rage and desperation. The serpent's fiery body lunged, its blazing heat warping the air as it bore down on the intruder. The figure, however, didn't move. They stood perfectly still, their blade lowered, as if waiting for the inevitable. And then, at the last possible moment, swoosh, the figure moved. Chapter 322. Veilric 2. The figure remained still until the serpent's fiery maw was nearly upon them. Then, with a single, deliberate step, they moved. First movement. The figure's blade traced a wide, sweeping arc, a ring of black starlight flaring to life as the motion completed. The ring pulsed with an eerie energy, dark and radiant at the same time, as though it devoured the light around it. The starlight ring caught the fiery serpent mid-lunge, constricting its blazing form as if an invisible chain had bound it. The serpent hissed and writhed, its fiery coils struggling against the encircling starlight, but the figure held firm, their blades steady as they maintained the ring's pressure. The flames dimmed slightly, their brilliance choked by the oppressive force of the black energy. Second movement. The figure shifted seamlessly into their next motion, their blades slashing upward in a clean, vertical strike. The glow of their weapon intensified, and as it cut through the fiery serpent, the creature let out a deafening roar. The room trembled as the blade cleaved the molten construct in two, the fiery have splitting apart with a burst of sparks and embers. Veilric's eyes widened in disbelief as the remnants of his ultimate technique dissolved into nothingness, the oppressive heat replaced by the chilling presence of the figure's starlight-infused blade. Third movement. Without hesitation, the figure lunged forward, his blade snapping into a precise, lightning-fast thrust. The black starlight surrounding it condensed into a single, concentrated point at the tip, the energy shimmering like a dark star. Void Starfall Blade. Starlight Needle, they intoned, their voice calm and deliberate as the blade shot toward Veilric's chest. The overwhelming danger was immediate and undeniable. Veilric's instincts screamed, his body moving before his mind could process. He forced himself to leap back, the motion abrupt and strained. Crack! The energy of the starlight needle grazed his side, the mere proximity of its power sending a searing pain through his body. Veilric landed heavily, coughing up blood as he clutched his ribs. His fiery aura flickered erratically, his body trembling from the strain of forcefully canceling his earlier technique. His breath came in ragged gasps as he glared at the figure, his voice a hoarse snarl. "Who are you? Why are you doing this?" The figure tilted their heads slightly, their stance relaxed despite the chaos. The glow of their blade dimmed, but their presence remained no less menacing. "Who I am," the figure murmured, their voice tinged with mocking amusement. "Does it really matter to you, Veilric?" They stepped closer, their dark aura pressing down on him like a suffocating weight. "Your end is near. What difference would knowing make?" Veilric's mind raced, fear and anger twisting in his gut. This wasn't just an intruder. Whoever this person was, they weren't here by accident. They had come with purpose, and Veilric, for all his power, was now acutely aware of how close he was to losing everything. His chest heaved as he forced himself upright, the searing pain in his ribs threatening to pull him back down. Blood dripped from the corner of his mouth, but his fiery amber eyes burned with a desperate resolve. He couldn't afford to hesitate. In battles of this level, seconds decided everything. Hesitation meant death. It was a principle he had lived by and one that had carried him to his current strength. Now it would be tested more than ever before. "Damn it," he hissed, his voice hoarse but steady. With a sharp movement, he reached into the folds of his robe and pulled out a small, gleaming pill. A precious Emberheart revival pill, crafted to heal wounds and restore vitality in an instant. It was a treasure he had hoarded for years, only to be used in moments of absolute desperation. Bite! The pill crunched between his teeth, releasing a rush of burning energy through his body. Veilric let out a sharp exhale as the warmth spread, dulling the pain in his ribs and steadying his trembling limbs. His aura flared brighter, crackling like an inferno as the pill did its work. He straightened, his grip tightening around his blade. No holding back, he muttered. Not now. Swoosh. In an instant, he launched himself forward, his fiery aura trailing behind him like a blazing comet. His opponent's calm figure loomed closer, their silhouette sharp against the flickering light of the torches. Veilric's gaze narrowed, his entire being focused on one final, decisive strike. Hydra Ascension of Crimson. He roared, his voice carrying the weight of his determination. The technique was his ultimate move, a culmination of his years of training and mastery. Mana surged from his core, flooding through his veins in a torrent of fiery energy. His blade ignited, a serpent of flame coiling around its length as he swung it forward with everything he had. The flames roared like a living beast, the serpent's fangs aimed directly at his enemy's heart. The chamber was engulfed in a blinding blaze, the heat searing even the stone walls. The ground beneath them cracked and splintered as Veilric's strike tore through the air with devastating force. He knew this attack would leave him drained, his core nearly empty, but he didn't care. Victory required sacrifice, and this was his only chance. But then, the figure moved once again. Swish. The blinding blaze of Veilric's technique illuminated the chamber, casting wild shadows on the cracked stone walls. His fiery serpent roared forward, its three heads twisting and snapping with lethal intent. This was his trump card, his absolute strongest move. And yet, the figure remained composed, their movements deliberate as they stepped into the storm. First movement, the starlight ring. The figure's estoc moved in a precise, circular motion, their wrist rotating effortlessly as the blade traced a glowing ring of black starlight. The ring surged outward, coiling around one of the serpent's heads like an iron collar. The flaming maw thrashed and snapped, but the starlight constricted tighter, snuffing it out with a hiss. Veilric's eyes narrowed, a grin spreading across his bloodied lips. You think that's enough? He spat, his voice hoarse but defiant. There are still two more. The remaining two heads of the serpent lunged forward, their fiery jaws snapping with savage force. They twisted in tandem, aiming to encircle the figure from both sides. Heh! Veilric chuckled darkly, confident he had outmaneuvered them. Let's see you stop this. Second movement. Starline. The figure's feet shifted, their body twisting with a fluid grace that defied the chaos around them. Their estoc came up in a sharp, vertical slash, the black starlight surging along its length. The blade seemed to extend, its shadowy energy slicing cleanly through the nearest serpent head. Swish! Crack! The flaming head burst into embers, the energy dissipating into the air. Without pausing, the figure pivoted on their back foot, their arms swinging low in a sweeping arc to meet the final head. Third movement. The void pierces all. The last head roared toward them, its fiery maw wide open as if to devour them whole. The figure's estoc darted forward in a deadly thrust, black starlight condensing at the tip in a concentrated burst of destructive energy. The motion was precise. Their left foot angled slightly outward for balance, their torso leaning forward as their arm extended in a straight, powerful line. The blade pierced the serpent's head directly between its fiery eyes, and the concentrated energy erupted outward in a sharp, resonant blast. Boom! The final head shattered, the remnants of Veilric's ultimate technique vanishing into sparks and fading flames. Veilric staggered back, his wide eyes reflecting disbelief. He clutched his blade tightly, his knuckles white. Impossible! He muttered, his voice trembling. Someone this strong is here? Why? Veilric's legs trembled as he tried to steady himself, his fiery aura flickering weakly around him. His eyes darted toward the enemy, his mind racing with questions that clawed at his sanity. Why? He spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of fury and despair. Why is someone like you here? Why are you targeting me? The figure stood still, their calm demeanor unshaken by Veilric's outburst. Their dark, shadow-cloaked aura seemed to consume the very air around them, an oppressive void that defied reason. Slowly, a small, faint smile curved their lips. Then, from the shadows above, a sleek figure leapt down onto the man's shoulder with eerie grace. Veilric's eyes widened in horror. No, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own heartbeat. His gaze locked onto the creature perched on the man's shoulder, a lithe, silvery feline with eyes like shimmering stars. The cat tilted its head, its ethereal presence unmistakable. "Vitaliera!" Veilric roared, his voice echoing with desperation and disbelief. You're here. You've aligned with him?" The man's smile grew slightly, and his free hand rose to gently stroke Vitaliara's fur. The guardian beast purred softly, its celestial aura glowing faintly in response. Veilric's breath hitched, his mind spiraling. This was it, the culmination of everything he had feared. The beast he had spent so long hunting, the key to his salvation, was not only alive but had turned against him. Veilric began, his voice breaking. "Goodbye," the figure interrupted, their tone calm, almost mocking. The Estoc surged forward, cloaked in a cascade of black starlight. The energy was blinding, a concentrated void of destruction that seemed to bend reality itself. Veilric barely had time to react as the blade pierced his chest with deadly precision. "Ha!" The word escaped his lips, a faint, confused exhale as the world seemed to slow. He looked down, his amber eyes widening as he saw the dark energy swirling around the wound. Heat began to radiate from his core, a searing intensity that spread rapidly through his body. The figure stepped back, pulling the blade free with a smooth motion. Veilric staggered, his hands clutching at his chest as the heat intensified. His fiery aura sputtered, flickering wildly before it was consumed entirely by the dark energy now coursing through him. "No," he gasped, his voice a broken whisper. "No, this can't." But before he could finish the thought, his body erupted in a violent explosion of black and crimson light. The force shattered the stone floor beneath him, sending shockwaves through the chamber. Veilric's final moments were consumed by the searing heat and the realization that he had lost. Not just the battle, but everything. Chapter 323. A Mother's Strength. Lucavion stood over the charred and broken remains of Veilric, his estoc still faintly glowing with the remnants of black starlight. The air was thick with the acrid smell of ash and mana residue, a stark reminder of the battle that had just unfolded. His eyes narrowed as he surveyed the scene, the faintest hint of a smirk playing on his lips. "Now he is dead," Lucavion thought to himself, his tone devoid of satisfaction or regret. It was simply a fact, cold and unyielding. "Yeah." Vitaliara's voice entered his mind, soft yet weighted. She perched on his shoulder, her ethereal presence both comforting and disquieting. Her golden eyes, usually so vibrant, now shimmered with an unspoken conflict. Veilric's body, or what remained of it, lay sprawled on the fractured obsidian floor. He was the architect of so much destruction, the one who had torn apart the Azure Blossom sect and forced Vitaliera to flee into the shadows. And yet, even in death, his presence lingered like a ghost, heavy and inescapable. Lucavion's gaze remained fixed on Veilric's remains, his mind as calm as the still air around him. The faint hum of his flame of equinox echoed softly in his ears, the flickering black fire surrounding his estoc dying down slowly. He felt the pull of something lingering, an afterimage of power, a dark residue that clung to the ruins of Veilric's form. Vitaliera leapt gracefully from his shoulder to the ground, her golden eyes locked onto the crumpled remains. Her fur shimmered faintly, her celestial energy responding to the oppressive weight of death that filled the air. She turned to him, her voice a whisper carried by the stillness. "Absorb him." Lucavion's lips curved into a slight smirk, a familiar edge of mischief in his dark eyes. Straight to the point, huh? But there was no real jest in his tone. He understood her meaning entirely. The energy coursing through Veilric's body was potent, raw, untapped, and born of years of cultivation. It would not go to waste. Without hesitation, he raised his estoc, the blade reigniting with a ripple of black starlight. The flame of equinox coiled and writhed along its length, its dual nature, a balance of life and death, ready to consume the remnants of Veilric's power. The flame flickered before surging outward, stretching like a living tendril toward the remains. As it made contact, the mana residue erupted in a burst of crimson light, the final resistance of Veilric's fading will. The energy recoiled before succumbing, drawn inexorably into the hungry flames. Lucavion felt the surge of power the moment it entered him. A rush of vitality mingled with the essence of death, rich and potent. His breath hitched as his body absorbed it, the intensity of Veilric's mid-4-star realm power overwhelming for a brief moment. This energy, he thought, his smirk fading as his focus sharpened. It was intoxicating, almost alive, coursing through his veins and sinking deep into the very core of his being. It wasn't just raw power. It carried the weight of Veilric's battles, his cruelty, his ambitions. The rush was both a gift and a curse, a reminder of what it took to claim strength in a world so unforgiving. Vitalera's flames rose beside his, and a faint shimmer of ethereal light added to the scene. She observed the process with an unreadable expression, her voice entering his thoughts once more. You knew what he was. You knew the value of his death. Lucavion nodded faintly, his gaze not leaving the swirling flames. Of course I knew. A mid-4-star realm cultivator doesn't come around every day. His tone carried a quiet confidence, but beneath it was the sharp edge of calculation. That's why I brought the mercenaries. Without them dividing his forces, I would have faced a gauntlet just to get here. A risk worth taking, but one that could have ended in my death. He clenched his fist as the flames settled, their energy coalescing within him. His body pulsed with newfound strength, the essence of Veilric's death now his to wield. The sensation was both satisfying and sobering, a reminder of the cost of power. Vitalera's golden eyes flickered toward him, her tail curling slightly as she absorbed his thoughts. You're always calculating, aren't you? Even now. Lucavion allowed himself a small chuckle, lowering his estoc as the last remnants of Veilric's energy faded into him. Calculating? I wouldn't say that. Practical? Absolutely. If I hadn't been, we wouldn't be standing here. Her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before shifting back to the smoldering remnants. It's fitting in a way, she said softly, that the power he used to destroy so much is now the foundation of something greater. Lucavion's smirk returned, his confidence tempered with a rare note of reflection. Fitting or ironic, I'll take it either way. Thud. Just then someone moved right at that moment. Lucavion's smirk disappeared, replaced by a sharp, calculated expression as the sound reverberated through the chamber. He turned toward the noise, his estoc steady in his hand. Vitalera perched back onto his shoulder, her ethereal body tense, the glow in her golden eyes flickering with unease. The source of the disturbance was clear now, a figure leaning heavily against a crumbled column at the far end of the chamber. Her silhouette was striking despite the state she was in. Long black hair cascaded down her back in a tangled mess, her figure voluptuous yet marred by countless bruises and scars. Her hood partially obscured her face, but her gray eyes were unmistakable, dull and hollow, like windows to a shattered soul. Lucavion approached her slowly, the echo of his boots the only sound. Vitalera's voice trembled in his mind. Gabriella? Her disbelief carried the weight of recognition and sorrow, yet it was laced with hesitation as if she couldn't bear to confirm what her eyes saw. Lucavion stopped just short of the woman, his eyes narrowing. He could see the faint rise and fall of her chest, the labored breaths of someone who had endured far more than their share of suffering. She stirred slightly, her head tilting toward him with an effort that seemed to cost her what little strength she had left. Ah! The woman named Gabriella's lips parted, a faint sound escaping her as her eyes focused with growing clarity. Her gaze shifted past Lucavion and landed on Vitalera, who stood at his side, her celestial fur glowing faintly as if responding to the woman's presence. Lady Vitalera, Gabriella's voice cracked, hoarse and strained, each word seemingly pulled from the depths of her exhaustion. Despite her weakened state, there was a faint reverence in her tone, a whisper of who she once was. Lucavion's brow furrowed as he glanced at Vitalera, his mind already racing to connect the threads of this unexpected encounter. "You know her?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with curiosity. Vital Yara's golden eyes shimmered, her tail curling tightly around her small frame. "I do," she replied, her voice soft yet heavy with emotion. She stepped closer to Gabriella, her movements deliberate, as if she were approaching a sacred memory. "She is, or was, Gabriella Aelthane, sect master of the Azure Blossom sect. My aide." Lucavion tilted his head slightly, studying Gabriella with a slight sense. "That sect." His tone was neutral, but his gaze sharpened as he considered the implications. A mid-4-star warrior reduced to this, it was both a testament to her strength and a grim reminder of the devastation wrought by Veilric. Gabriella's breath hitched at the mention of Veilric, her body trembling faintly. She clutched the edge of her tattered cloak, her fingers weak but determined. You've slain him?" she rasped, her gray eyes searching Lucavion's face as though seeking confirmation. Lucavion nodded, his smirk returning, albeit tempered by gravity. "He's gone. Permanently. You have my word." A fleeting spark of relief flickered in Gabriella's eyes, but it was quickly overshadowed by a wave of pain. She slumped further against the column, her strength waning. Vitaliera leaped to her side, nuzzling Gabriella's arm with a gentleness Lucavion rarely saw in her. "Rest, Gabriella. You're safe now." Lucavion's sharp gaze held steady as he observed Gabriella, her trembling form slumped against the column. Despite Vital Yara's attempt to offer comfort, the celestial creature's efforts seemed to dissipate in the heavy silence. Gabriella's gray eyes stared blankly past them both, devoid of light, of hope, of any tether to the world around her. Lucavion took a step back, his expression hardening. "I see," he murmured, his voice low and measured. He studied her carefully, noting the utter hollowness in her gaze. Her body remained upright by sheer force of habit, but her spirit, her very essence, was gone. Her eyes told him everything. They were the eyes of someone who had lost everything, someone who had been drained of the will to fight, to dream, to live. Lucavion knew those eyes all too well. He had seen them in countless souls broken by the weight of a cruel world. "You are gone," he whispered, the words heavy with understanding and finality. Gabriella didn't react. She didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge his presence. She remained a fragile shell, a ghost of who she once was. Her silence only solidified what Lucavion already knew. His fingers tightened around the hilt of his estoc. Slowly, deliberately, he drew the blade from its sheath, its dark metal catching the dim light of the chamber. The flame of equinox flickered faintly along the edge, a soft hum of life and death coiling in harmony. Then Lucavion said, his voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of sorrow, "Let me grant you the end you long for." Chapter 3:24. A promise. Then, "Let me grant you the end you long for." Vitaliera leapt in front of Gabriella, her golden eyes blazing as her voice roared in his mind. "Lucavion, what are you doing?" He didn't waver, his grip on the estoc firm. "This is for the better," he thought, his inner voice calm yet resolute as he directed his thoughts to Vitaliera. "Look at her." Vitaliera glanced back at Gabriella, her celestial form trembling as she saw the truth. Gabriella didn't move to protect herself. She didn't protest. She simply sat there, lifeless, her gaze fixed on nothing. "But she can recover." Vital Yara's voice cracked with desperation, her plea ringing in his mind. "She's not beyond saving." Lucavion shook his head slightly, his smirk gone, replaced by a cold, pragmatic expression. "Recovery requires a desire to live," he said softly, his eyes never leaving Gabriella. "She doesn't have that anymore. She's already made her choice." He raised his sword. Just then Gabriel's voice came with a low tone. Lucavion's estoc hovered in the air, the faint hum of the flame of equinox vibrating along its edge as he prepared to strike. But just as the blade was about to fall, a faint sound reached his ears, hoarse, broken, yet filled with more weight than any shout. "My daughter, please." Gabriella's voice cracked, barely audible, yet it carried through the stillness of the chamber like a thunderclap. Her lips moved slowly, the words drawn from a place deep within her that hadn't been entirely extinguished. Not as a sect master, not as a warrior, but as a mother. Lucavion froze. His sharp gaze locked onto Gabriella, and for the first time, he saw something stirring behind the emptiness in her eyes. A glimmer of purpose, fragile but undeniable. His blade lingered mid-air, caught between his initial resolve and the unexpected weight of her plea. Vital Yara's golden eyes widened, a faint shimmer of tears reflecting her own inner turmoil. "Gabriella!" she whispered in his mind, her voice trembling with emotion. Lucavion's expression softened, though his grip on the estoc remained steady. He took a measured breath, lowering the blade slightly. "Your daughter," he murmured, his voice steady but tinged with curiosity and understanding. "If she's still out there, you can leave it to me." Gabriella's lips trembled, the faintest hint of a smile ghosting across her face. Her eyes met his for a fleeting moment, and in that instant, something unspoken passed between them. "You see," Lucavion continued, a shadow of his smirk returning, though tempered by a rare sincerity. "I'm quite good at taking care of other people's daughters." The faint smile on Gabriella's lips grew just enough to shine through her exhaustion. "Ah, I am glad," she whispered, her voice so soft it could barely be heard. The glimmer in her eyes faded, her body relaxing as though the weight of the world had finally been lifted from her shoulders. Lucavion inhaled deeply, his gaze steady and composed as he raised the estoc one final time. The black starlight along its edge dimmed, replaced by a soft, ethereal glow. The sword of life. Gentle blade. The flame coiled with a radiant balance of life's light, a gesture of respect to the woman before him. Vitaliera stepped aside, her form trembling but silent as she watched. "You'll make it painless?" she asked, her voice no louder than a whisper in his mind. Lucavion nodded once. Of course. He brought the blade down in one smooth, graceful motion. The light from the gentle blade pulsed gently, wrapping around Gabriella like a shroud, easing her final moments with a warmth that seemed to erase her pain. As her final breath escaped her lips, the chamber fell silent. Gabriella's body slumped, her expression serene, as though she had finally found the peace that had eluded her for so long. Lucavion sheathed his estoc with a sharp click, his expression unreadable as he turned to Vitaliera. "Her daughter," he said simply, his voice calm yet resolute. "Iliana." Vitaliara's voice entered Lucavion's mind, quiet but firm, carrying the weight of memory. "Her daughter's name is Iliana." Lucavion paused, his gaze lingering for a moment on Gabriella's lifeless form. He repeated the name under his breath, testing its weight. "Iliana," he murmured, his tone thoughtful yet resolute, as though the name itself carried a new purpose. The chamber was heavy with silence, broken only by the faint echo of his boots as he turned and began to walk. Vitaliera leapt gracefully to his shoulder, her celestial fur dimmed but steady, the glow in her golden eyes subdued. She didn't speak immediately, sensing the unspoken gravity in his stride. Lucavion's steps were measured, deliberate, as he moved through the broken remains of the chamber. The flickering remnants of his flame of equinox glimmered faintly in the distance, casting long shadows across the fractured obsidian floor. His mind, however, was focused on the single name echoing in his thoughts. "Iliana," he repeated softly, as if to himself, the sound mingling with the quiet hum of mana in the air. "What do you intend to do?" Vitaliera finally asked, her voice tentative but curious. Lucavion's lips curled into a faint, almost sardonic smile, though his eyes held none of their usual mischief. "Isn't it obvious? Find her." He glanced at Vitaliera, his expression sharpening. "If Gabriella held on this long for her daughter, there's a reason, and I intend to see what that reason is." The lion strode briskly through the darkened halls of the Crimson Serpent sect, his boots clicking against the polished stone floor as he moved toward his father's residence. The events in the prison chamber had left him agitated, but he shook off the unease with a sharp breath. He needed to speak to Veilric. Whatever was happening in Thornridge was growing more dire by the moment, and answers were needed. The narrow corridor gave way to the open courtyard, the cool night air brushing against his face. But as he stepped outside, he froze mid-step, his breath hitching. The courtyard was littered with bodies. Countless corpses of his fellow disciples lay strewn across the cobblestones, their crimson robes soaked in blood. The torches lining the perimeter flickered dimly, casting eerie shadows over the carnage. The metallic stench of death filled the air, mingling with the faint tang of burning wood. What happened here?" the lion whispered, his voice trembling as his gaze darted from one lifeless form to another. His disciples, his sex people, were dead, their faces frozen in expressions of terror and pain. Many bore deep, precise wounds, their deaths clearly the work of someone skilled. Others looked as though they'd been torn apart by sheer force, their bodies mangled and unrecognizable. For a moment he was paralyzed, his mind struggling to process the scene before him. He stepped forward slowly, his boots crunching on shattered debris and bloodied cloth. His eyes narrowed, searching for any sign of life among the dead. This can't be," the lion muttered. Who did this?" The unease bubbling within him began to grow into something darker. Fear. He had seen death before, of course. As the heir to the Crimson Serpent sect, he had fought and killed many times. But this was different. This wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. He crouched beside one of the corpses, a young disciple whose wide, lifeless eyes stared blankly at the night sky. A deep slash ran across his chest, the cut clean and deliberate. The lion reached out hesitantly, touching the blood-soaked robes. They were still warm. "Who could do this?" he whispered, his voice trembling with disbelief. The disciples of the Crimson Serpent sect were no weaklings. Even the lowest among them were seasoned fighters, skilled in combat and imbued with the sect's fiery techniques. For so many of them to fall so quickly, Thalian's breath came in ragged gasps as he tore through the corridors of the sect, his boots pounding against the stone floor. The carnage in the courtyard burned in his mind, a horrifying image he couldn't shake. The disciples were dead, their blood soaking the cobblestones, and he had no idea who or what could have done this. There was only one person who might have answers: his father. Veilric was the strongest in the sect, the pillar upon which the Crimson Serpent sect had been built. If anyone could stop this madness, it was him. The lion clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on the hilt of his blade as he pushed forward, ignoring the twisting unease in his gut. As he neared the grand doors of his father's chambers, he slowed. The faint hum of a presence emanated from within, a powerful energy that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The lion frowned, his hand hovering over the door handle. "Father," he muttered under his breath. "He's here." The thought brought a small measure of relief. Veilric's chambers were forbidden to all but the sect master himself. No one else could or would dare enter. The energy inside had to be his father's. And yet, something felt wrong. The air was thick with tension, and the faint metallic tang of blood lingered. He pushed the door open cautiously, stepping inside. The scene that greeted him made his blood run cold. Chapter 325, Tylon. The moment that Tylon had pushed the door, the scene that greeted him made his blood run cold. Blood was splattered across the walls, pooling on the polished marble floor. The room, once a symbol of Veilric's power and authority, was now a gruesome tableau of violence. In the center of the carnage lay a body, or rather what was left of one. Only the lower half remained, the torso and head missing entirely. The dismembered remains were twisted and grotesque, as though they had been savaged by something monstrous. Thalian's eyes widened in horror as he recognized the tattered, blood-soaked robes on the lower half of the body. "Father," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. His legs felt weak, his chest tightening as the realization sank in. This mangled corpse, it belonged to Veilric. His mind raced, unable to reconcile the image before him. Veilric, the most powerful man in the Crimson Serpent sect, the peak 4-star awakened on the verge of a breakthrough, was dead. Not just dead, obliterated. "Father!" The lion screamed, his voice breaking. He stumbled forward, his trembling hands reaching out toward the remains. But before he could take another step, a voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Oh, you're his son." The lion froze. The voice was smooth, mocking, and carried an air of casual confidence. He turned sharply, his eyes darting to the source. Thalion's body snapped toward the voice, his head swiveling to the side where the sound had come from. His heart hammered in his chest, and his breath hitched as his gaze landed on a figure stepping from the shadows. It was a young man, clad in dark clothing that seemed to meld with the dim light of the room. His movements were deliberate, almost leisurely, as though the chaos and carnage around him were of no consequence. But it wasn't his attire or his calm demeanor that struck the lion. It was his eyes. The young man's gaze bore into the lion with a force that was almost physical, an intensity that twisted the air around him. His eyes gleamed with something indescribable, a cold, unyielding intent that sliced through Thalion's fragile composure like a blade. It wasn't anger. It wasn't hatred. It was something worse. For a fleeting second, the lion tried to meet the young man's gaze, to anchor himself against the oppressive weight of his presence. But the effort was futile. The sheer intent in those eyes, the quiet, undeniable promise of destruction, forced him to avert his gaze. His head turned involuntarily, his body recoiling as though struck. His breath quickened, his chest rising and falling erratically. A cold sweat broke out along his brow, his hands trembling as he gripped his blade tighter. He felt it then, crawling up his spine and clutching his throat like an icy hand. "Fear," he muttered under his breath, the word barely audible as it escaped his lips. His body felt heavy, weighed down by an invisible force that sapped the strength from his legs. He wanted to move, to act, to strike, but he couldn't. The presence before him was suffocating, a void of power and malice that eclipsed everything else. The young man smirked, a small, almost amused curve of his lips. He took another step forward, his movements as smooth as a predator stalking its prey. "So," the young man said, his voice calm but laced with a quiet menace. "This is the heir of the Crimson Serpent sect, the son of Veilric." His gaze flicked briefly to the mangled remains on the floor, his smirk widening slightly. "Your father was quite disappointing. I expected more from the strongest in the city." Thalion's fingers twitched, his instincts screaming at him to fight, to run, to do something. But the weight of the young man's presence pinned him in place, rendering him unable to act. "Why?" The lion stammered, his voice shaking. "Why are you doing this? Who are you?" The young man tilted his head slightly, his smirk never faltering. "Why?" he repeated as though tasting the word. "Does it matter? Your father made his choices, and now he's paid the price. And you—" His gaze darkened, the oppressive air growing heavier. "You'll pay yours." Thalion's knees buckled slightly, his legs trembling beneath him. He tried to steel himself, to push past the fear clawing at his chest. But the young man's presence was like a black hole, pulling him deeper into despair. "No," the lion whispered, his voice barely audible. He tightened his grip on his blade, summoning every ounce of courage he could muster. I won't let you." The young man's smirk faded, his expression growing colder. "You won't let me?" he repeated, his tone devoid of amusement. He raised his hand, his fingers flexing slightly as a faint glow of dark energy began to gather around him. "Now that I think about it," the young man's dark energy swirled around him, faint motes of starlight shimmering in the oppressive void. His expression remained cold and detached, but his next words cut through the suffocating air with a razor's edge. "There is a chance," he said, his voice calm, almost contemplative. "A chance that you leave this place alive." Thalion's heart skipped a beat, his trembling hands tightening around his blade. The weight of the young man's presence didn't diminish, But those words held a faint glimmer of hope, one he desperately wanted to believe in. The young man tilted his head slightly, his cold gaze locking onto Thalian's. Though, he continued, his tone taking on a mocking edge, that chance only exists if you answer my question. The lion swallowed hard, his throat dry as the air grew heavier around him. What do you want to know? He forced out, his voice barely above a whisper. The young man stepped closer, each measured movement sending a jolt of dread through Thalian's body. His black estoc lowered slightly, the swirling energy around it pulsing faintly as he leaned forward, his voice soft but laced with menace. Where, he said, his words deliberate and precise, is the girl named Ileana? The name sent a cold shock through Thalian's veins. His eyes widened, and his breath hitched as realization struck him like a thunderclap. This wasn't just a random attack. This wasn't about his father or the Crimson Serpent sex power. This man had come here with a purpose, and that purpose was Ileana. He knew. Thalian's mind raced, his thoughts spinning in a desperate storm. That's why he's here. That's why he killed father. It's all because of her. His fingers tightened around his blade, his knuckles turning white. He knew what this meant. He wasn't stupid. Even if he answered the question, even if he told this man exactly where Ileana was, it wouldn't matter. His father was dead. The sect was in ruins. And now there was no reason for him to be spared. Thalian's breath hitched, and for a moment, silence hung heavy in the blood-soaked chamber. Then, suddenly, a sound broke the stillness. Heh! It started as a low, guttural chuckle, rising from his throat like a twisted melody. His shoulders trembled as the laugh grew louder, unrestrained, echoing through the chamber with a wild, almost maniacal edge. His blade dropped to the floor with a dull clang as he threw his head back, laughing uncontrollably. Ahaha! All of this. He gasped between fits of laughter, his voice cracking under the weight of hysteria. You came all this way. You killed my father. You destroyed everything. For her. He doubled over, clutching his sides as his laughter turned darker, more venomous. I don't know whether to pity you or applaud your stupidity. The young man didn't move, his calm expression unchanging as he watched the lion with an almost clinical detachment. The oppressive energy around him seemed to tighten, but the lion was too far gone to notice. Finally, the lion straightened, his lips curling into a sneer. His eyes, filled with madness and spite, locked onto the young man. You think you're so terrifying, he spat, venom dripping from his words. You think you can break me? Fuck you. With a sharp inhale, the lion gathered the bile of his hatred and spat. The glob of saliva flew through the air, aiming for the young man's face, but it never landed. The moment it reached within inches of him, the spit hit an invisible barrier, sliding harmlessly down to the floor with a faint hiss. The young man's gaze didn't waver. If anything, the lack of reaction only made Thalian's hatred burn brighter. That bitch, the lion snarled, his voice low and venomous. I should have ped her when I had the chance. Maybe then she'd have been useful for something. He grinned, his teeth bared like a cornered animal. So go ahead. Kill me. You'll never find her. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. The faint flicker of starlight around the young man's blade grew brighter, sharper, the oppressive weight of his presence. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. The faint flicker of starlight around the young man's blade grew brighter, sharper, the oppressive weight of his presence becoming suffocating. For the first time, Thalian's grin faltered, his bravado cracking as the sheer force of the young man's intent bore down on him. The young man's voice was cold, devoid of emotion, as he finally spoke. I see, he said simply, his tone calm but chilling. Thank you for answering me. The young man's piercing gaze didn't falter as he took a step closer, his blade humming faintly with an unsettling energy. The oppressive aura in the room thickened, making it harder for the lion to breathe. He sneered, refusing to let the fear clawing at him show, but the slight twitch in his eye betrayed him. The young man tilted his head slightly, his voice calm but dripping with icy contempt. "This smell of yours. It's faint, but unmistakable." He leaned in slightly, his dark eyes locking onto Thalion's with an intensity that made the air feel heavy. "You just came from her side, didn't you?" Thalion's eyes widened imperceptibly, the twitch in his brow giving him away. His sneer faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flash of alarm. The young man's lips curled into a smirk. "Ah, so it's true. You've confirmed it for me." He straightened, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "Well then, it appears you've served your purpose." He took another step closer, his presence suffocating as he loomed over the lion. The flickering starlight around his blade flared briefly, illuminating the room in sharp, cold light. "Though," the young man said, his tone sharp with disdain, "talking about our *P like that is kind of shallow, don't you think?" The lion opened his mouth to retort, but before he could form the words, the blade moved. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. The strikes were impossibly fast, so swift that the lion didn't even register the pain at first. The faint, metallic sound of steel slicing through flesh and bone echoed in the room, followed by the dull thuds of severed digits hitting the bloodied floor. Thalion's eyes darted downward in horror. 6 fingers, 3 from each hand, lay scattered on the ground, twitching grotesquely. His right leg had been severed cleanly just above the knee, blood pouring from the stump in sickening gushes. His mind struggled to process what had just happened, but then the pain hit him like a tidal wave. "Aya!" The lion screamed, his voice raw and guttural as he collapsed to the floor, clutching the stumps of his mutilated hands. Blood seeped between his trembling fingers, staining the already crimson floor. His leg twitched uselessly, the agony radiating up his body with every heartbeat. The young man stood over him, calm and unflinching. He tilted his head slightly, his expression devoid of pity. "Now," he said, his voice eerily soft, "next time, be mindful of your words." Gulp, and he forcefully fed Tylon a small vial. "Goodbye." Chapter 326. Disciples. Lucavion turned to Vitaliera, her celestial form perched on his shoulder, her golden eyes flickering with intensity. She had been the one to discover the unique scent clinging faintly to Thalion's mangled body, a subtle but unmistakable trail that led them deeper into the Crimson Serpent Sect's stronghold. Her nose, attuned to the finer nuances of mana and life essence, had guided them this far. "It's faint, but I'm sure of it," Vitaliera said firmly, her voice clear in Lucavion's mind. "This scent, it leads to something hidden below." Lucavion gave a curt nod, his dark eyes narrowing as he focused on the path ahead. Without a word, he strode forward, his estoc gleaming faintly with the residue of the flame of equinox. His pace quickened as they moved through the blood-soaked corridors, his blade striking down anyone foolish enough to stand in his way. Crimson arcs of blood painted the walls and floors as screams echoed briefly before being silenced. The deeper they descended, the colder and more oppressive the air became. The faint scent Vitaliera had detected grew stronger, laced with hints of decay and despair. Lucavion's expression remained unreadable, though his eyes burned with a cold, unyielding determination. Finally, Vitaliera's tail lashed with urgency. "We're close. Just ahead, Lucavion." The corridor opened into a narrow staircase spiraling downward into darkness. Lucavion didn't hesitate, his boots echoing against the stone steps as he descended rapidly. The oppressive atmosphere thickened, and with each step, the scent became more distinct. A mixture of desperation and muted power, suppressed by something unnatural. At the bottom of the staircase, a heavy iron door barred their way. Lucavion placed his hand on it, his flame of equinox surging along the metal. With a sharp, deliberate push, he forced it open, the hinges groaning in protest. The scene that greeted them was both shocking and infuriating. Rows of chambers stretched out before them, each one containing malnourished figures. Their gaunt faces and hollow eyes spoke of prolonged suffering, their bodies weak from neglect. Most of them were cuffed with glinting, rune-etched artifacts designed to suppress their awakened abilities, rendering them helpless. Vital Yara's breath hitched, her fur bristling as her golden eyes scanned the prisoners. "I recognize some of them," she whispered, her voice heavy with sorrow. "They're from the Azure Blossom sect." These were Gabriella's disciples. Lucavion's gaze swept over the chambers, his sharp mind processing the scope of what he was seeing. "So, this is what became of them," he murmured, his voice low and cold. Veilric didn't just destroy the sect. He turned its survivors into tools. The despair in the air was palpable, but Lucavion didn't falter. He stepped into the room, his blade ready as his eyes darted between the chambers. Vitaliera leapt down, pacing anxiously as she recognized more familiar faces. "We need to free them, Lucavion. They've suffered enough." Lucavion nodded, his mind already working through the situation. The cuffs would need to be destroyed, and the disciples, though weakened, would require guidance to escape. It wouldn't be easy, but the path forward was clear. He approached one of the chambers, his gaze locking onto a young woman slumped against the back wall. Her once pristine robes were tattered, and her skin was pale and bruised, but there was a faint glimmer of defiance in her eyes, a spark that hadn't yet been extinguished. "Rest easy," Lucavion said softly, his voice carrying an uncharacteristic note of reassurance. "Your time in this prison is over." He raised his blade, the flame of equinox flaring to life as he prepared to cut through the restraints. Behind him, Vital Yara's golden eyes shimmered with determination. As Lucavion's blade flared to life, casting ethereal shadows across the chamber, a sudden cry broke the oppressive silence. "Lady Vitaliera?" The voice was hoarse, trembling with disbelief. Lucavion paused mid-strike, his sharp gaze snapping to the source of the voice, a gaunt man clutching the bars of his chamber. His hollow eyes, sunken with malnourishment, widened as they fixed on the celestial figure beside Lucavion. "Lady Vital Yara," another voice shouted, the desperate hope in the cry reverberating through the chamber. "You're back!" A wave of whispers and exclamations followed, filling the air with a mixture of disbelief and elation. Figures stirred in their cells, weak hands reaching through the bars as more voices joined the chorus. "It's her. She's returned. Lady Vitaliera is here." Vital Yara's fur bristled with emotion as she stepped closer to Lucavion's shoulder, her golden eyes scanning the disciples who now stared at her with expressions that ranged from stunned disbelief to unrestrained joy. "They recognize me," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. Even after all this time, Lucavion's expression softened slightly, though his eyes remained calculating. He glanced at Vitaliera, noting the way her presence seemed to breathe life into the broken figures before them. He understood their reaction perfectly. She was their guardian, Lucavion thought, his mind piecing together the fragments of their shared history. The one who protected their sect when it still stood. Even if they barely knew her personally, her presence must have been a symbol of strength, of hope. He glanced back at the trembling figures. And they've been living without either for far too long. "Lady Vitaliera," the young woman in the chamber before Lucavion whispered, her voice barely audible but heavy with reverence. She reached out a trembling hand toward Vitaliera, her eyes filling with tears. "You've come back. You've come to save us." Vitaliera leapt gracefully from Lucavion's shoulder, landing on the stone floor with quiet dignity. She padded closer to the bars of the chamber, her celestial form glowing faintly in the dim light. "I've returned," she said softly, her voice resonating with warmth and sorrow. "I'm sorry it took so long." The disciples in the chambers pressed closer to their bars, their faces alight with something they hadn't felt in years, hope. Lucavion observed the scene silently, his blade still glowing with the flame of equinox. He could see the fragile balance in their expressions, the way they clung to Vital Yara's presence as though it were the only thing keeping them upright. Without a word, he turned back to the restraints binding the young woman before him and brought the blade down in a precise, fluid motion. The cuffs shattered, the suppression runes flickering and dying. The young woman gasped, the sudden release of her mana like a flood breaking through a dam. She collapsed forward, her body trembling as she struggled to steady herself. "Rest," Lucavion said simply, his voice calm yet firm. "Your strength will return. You'll need it." One by one, he moved to the other chambers, his blade striking with precision to free the disciples. Each time the restraints shattered, the same mixture of disbelief and gratitude spread through the air, their gazes alternating between him and Vitaliera. Vitaliera turned to Lucavion, her voice steady but filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Lucavion, for this." Lucavion smirked faintly, his eyes glinting with his usual sharpness. "I'm just the executioner," he replied, though his tone carried a rare note of sincerity. "You're the one they needed to see." As Lucavion moved through the chambers, his blade striking with precision to shatter the restraints of the Azure Blossom sect disciples, his steps eventually carried him to the very end of the corridor. A faint, chilling hum resonated from the last cell, distinct from the others. Vitaliera paused beside him, her golden eyes narrowing as she peered at the iron door reinforced with layers of intricate runes. "This cell." Vitaliera's voice trembled slightly, a mix of recognition and unease threading her tone. "It's different. It was meant to hold someone special." Lucavion tilted his head, his dark eyes scanning the markings on the door. "Special," he echoed, his voice calm yet curious. He extended his hand, the flame of equinox, flaring as he pressed his palm against the cold iron. The runes flared briefly before disintegrating under the weight of his mana. With a sharp motion, he pushed the door open, the groan of the hinges reverberating through the corridor. The iron door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit chamber. Unlike the other cells, this one bore an air of restraint rather than outright neglect. The faint scent of stale mana lingered, and though the woman inside was gaunt and malnourished like the others, there was an undeniable sharpness to her gaze, a flicker of vitality that hadn't been entirely extinguished. Lucavion's eyes immediately locked onto her as she sat upright against the far wall, her wrists bound by rune-etched cuffs. Her long, dark hair framed a face marked with exhaustion but still strikingly composed. The moment Lucavion stepped into the cell, her eyes snapped upward, sharp and alert. "Ah!" she breathed, her voice cracking with the strain of disuse. Her gray eyes widened as they settled on the small, glowing figure that padded into the room beside Lucavion. "Lady Vitaliera." The reverence in her tone was unmistakable, her expression a mixture of disbelief and joy. She struggled to rise, her cuffed hands trembling as she tried to push herself up. Vitaliera leapt gracefully to the floor, her celestial glow illuminating the woman's gaunt features. "Yes, it's me," she said softly, her voice warm yet tinged with sorrow. "I've returned." But instead of relief, the woman's face twisted into a grimace. "Why?" she demanded, her voice hoarse but sharp. "Why did you come back? You should have escaped. It's much more dangerous now." Her tone was laced with urgency and fear, as though her words alone could shield Vitaliera from some unseen peril. Lucavion's brows lifted slightly, the corner of his mouth curving into a faint smirk. "Grateful, aren't you?" he remarked dryly, his tone light but edged with amusement. "We just risked quite a lot to find you." The woman's sharp gaze darted to Lucavion, her gray eyes narrowing slightly as though trying to measure him. "You don't understand," she said firmly, her voice gaining strength. "The Crimson Serpent sect, they are really strong. Their leader, Veilric, he is a peak 4-star warrior. Ah, that guy, he is dead. I just killed him." At that, the girl's chin fell to the ground. "What?" Chapter 327. Don't lie. The gaunt mouth hung open, her disbelief plain. She struggled to form words, her gaze darting between Lucavion and the faint glow of his flame of equinox that still lingered on the blade. You killed him?" she stammered, her voice hoarse and incredulous. "Don't lie. How could you possibly? He was a peak 4-star warrior." Her voice rose, trembling with desperation. "This is no time for jokes. You don't understand. Veilric was more monster than man. If he's gone, it wasn't by someone like you." Lucavion tilted his head, his expression calm but edged with faint amusement. That's quite the endorsement for his strength, but unfortunately for him, he underestimated mine. Veilric's body lies in pieces several floors above us. The woman's lips parted again as if to argue, but no words came. Her gaze fixed on Lucavion's youthful face, her brows knitting in disbelief. "You're lying?" she muttered, shaking her head, as if denying the possibility would make it less real. You can't have." "Ah, yes," Lucavion said, his tone turning light with mock indignation. "How could a mere youngster like me pull it off? Perhaps it was a stroke of luck, or maybe, just maybe, I'm not as ordinary as you think." Her hands tightened around the restraints still binding her. "Stop joking," she snapped, her desperation cutting through her disbelief. "Run now while you can. You've done enough. Save yourself. Save Lady Vitaliera. We can endure this, we always have." Lucavion's smirk deepened, the faint glow of his flame of equinox reflecting in his dark eyes. His tone softened but carried an unyielding edge as he replied, "I refuse." The gaunt girl, Ileana, as Vitaliera had identified her, blinked, startled. "Ha!" Lucavion took a deliberate step closer, leaning slightly forward as though about to deliver some grand declaration. "If there's one thing—" "Stop it!" Vitaliera interrupted sharply, her celestial form hopping to perch directly in front of his face. Her golden eyes glared at him with exasperation. "We don't have time for your eccentric poses, Lucavion." Lucavion sighed dramatically, drawing himself upright and looking distinctly unimpressed. "You're no fun, you know," he muttered, though the amusement in his eyes betrayed his mock indignation. "A little flair never hurt anyone." He shifted his focus back to the woman, his expression softening but losing none of its resolve. "Ileana, was it?" he asked, his voice steady but commanding. She hesitated, her lips trembling slightly. "Yes." "Good," Lucavion replied, inclining his head. "Stay here. I've already freed the others. Until I come back for you, don't leave this chamber. Get it?" "Wah," she began, her voice wavering with protest. "Get it?" Lucavion's tone sharpened just enough to leave no room for argument. Ileana faltered, her shoulders sagging as she lowered her gaze. "Understood." "Good," Lucavion said, the faintest curve of satisfaction on his lips. Without another word, he turned on his heel, his estoc gleaming faintly in the dim light as he strode toward the exit. Vitaliera leapt gracefully to his shoulder, her golden tail flicking as she glanced back at Ileana, who stood frozen in place. "We'll return soon. Stay strong." Her voice carried a comforting warmth, but her eyes mirrored Lucavion's resolve. Lucavion moved swiftly through the oppressive corridor, his boots striking the stone floor with purpose. His mind focused entirely on the task ahead. He ascended the spiraling staircase toward the upper levels, where more of the sect awaited their reckoning. Behind him, the faint echoes of prisoners stirring in their chambers were a testament to the hope he and Vitaliera had rekindled. "Hope," Lucavion mused to himself, his lips quirking into a faint smile. "Let's see if it burns as brightly for the rest of you as it does for her." The pounding of hooves echoed through the darkened streets of Thornridge as the two factions of elders tore through the city, each group vying to reach their targets first. The tension between them lingered like an unspoken curse, pushing them faster, harder, their breaths visible in the cold night air. Elder Varos, leading the group of Crimson Serpent sect originals, glanced over his shoulder at his two companions. "Stay sharp. The rats from the Azure Blossom sect may be racing ahead, but they'll only find death if they aren't careful." The wiry elder smirked, his eyes gleaming with malice. "Let them rush in blindly. We'll clean up their mess and take all the credit." Elder Giant's group was equally focused, though their approach carried an air of icy determination rather than reckless haste. Her scarred companion growled as he urged his steed forward. "They're trying to beat us to the target. Arrogant fools. They'll trip over themselves before they achieve anything meaningful," Giant replied, her voice calm but edged with steel. We're here to finish this efficiently. Keep your focus on the task. The streets narrowed as both groups veered toward their respective targets, their paths converging toward the same district. The scent of burning wood and the faint tang of blood grew stronger as they rode, the chaos of the mercenaries' attacks becoming increasingly evident. It was Elder Varos's group that first sensed it, a sharp spike of mana cutting through the ambient energy of the night. The air around them seemed to shiver with the force of an unleashed spell, and moments later, the distant clash of steel against steel rang out like a battle cry. Varos pulled his horse to an abrupt halt, his hulking frame tense as he scanned the darkness ahead. "Do you feel that?" he growled, his voice low and dangerous. The wiry elder nodded, his smirk replaced by a predatory gleam. "Someone's using mana. And those are blades I hear." Varos gripped the hilt of his axe, his knuckles whitening. "We've found them." Not far behind, Jayan and her group came to a similar realization. Her scarred ally tightened his grip on the reins, his eyes narrowing. "They're close. The mana is faint but unmistakable." Jayan raised a hand, signaling for silence. Her silver-streaked hair shimmered in the moonlight as she tilted her head, listening intently. The faint sound of clashing blades carried through the cold night air, accompanied by occasional bursts of mana pressure. "They're here," she said softly, her voice steady. "We'll approach from the flank. Let Varos and his dogs charge in if they want. We'll take the lead when it matters." Her companions exchanged grim nods, their weapons drawn as they dismounted and moved forward on foot. The shadows of Thornridge's narrow alleys swallowed them, their movements silent and calculated. Varos, true to his brash nature, wasted no time. With a sharp motion, he signaled his group to follow, his booming voice cutting through the tension. "Move! We'll crush them before the azure blossom rats can even lift their blades." The wiry elder chuckled darkly. "They won't even have time to realize what hit them." Their heavy footfalls echoed through the winding streets as they closed in on the source of the noise. The scent of blood grew stronger, mingling with the acrid tang of burning mana. As they rounded a corner, the scene unfolded before them. In a narrow courtyard, dimly lit by a flickering lantern, a group of mercenaries clashed with Crimson Serpent sect disciples. The disciples were clearly outmatched, their crimson robes streaked with blood as the mercenaries moved with deadly precision. The mercenaries worked in seamless tandem, their movements honed and efficient, each strike calculated to maim or kill. One mercenary, a towering figure wielding a halberd, brought his weapon down in a devastating arc, cleaving through a disciple's defenses. Another, a lithe woman with daggers, danced through the chaos, her blades flashing as they found their marks. "Mercenaries," Varos hissed, his grip tightening on his axe. "There they are." Boom! The clash of steel and the crackling surge of mana filled the courtyard. But it was the distant boom that snapped Varos's attention away from the scene before him. His sharp eyes darted to the horizon, where faint bursts of light illuminated another section of Thornridge. The unmistakable flare of mana reached his senses, a potent energy signature that could not be ignored. "Another group," Varos growled, his voice thick with irritation. He turned to the wiry elder at his side. "You take these fools. I'm heading to the other location." The wiry elder nodded, his smirk returning. "I'll finish this before you even arrive at your next fight." Varos snorted, gripping the hilt of his axe as he turned sharply. His heavy frame belied his speed as he launched himself into motion, his body propelled by the practiced movements of Qigong techniques. His form blurred as he leapt onto a nearby rooftop, his mana-infused steps carrying him across the city with unnatural agility. Not far behind, Jayan and her two allies crouched in the shadows, watching the chaos unfold. Her silver-streaked hair shimmered faintly under the moonlight as she observed the mercenaries with a calculated gaze. She opened her mouth to signal her next move, but another explosion rocked the air, followed by a distant roar of flames. Her scarred companion grimaced. "They're spread out. This is coordinated." "Deliberately so," Jayan replied, her voice calm but sharp. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the faint pulses of mana rippling through the air from multiple directions. They're dividing us. The burly elder clenched his fists, his scarred chin lifting. Should we regroup? No. Giant's response was swift and decisive. We'll cover more ground if we split. Stay focused and don't let their chaos dictate our actions. Her companions nodded, their confidence in her unshaken. The scarred elder tightened his gauntlets, his body radiating mana as he prepared to move. I'll handle the east, he said, his voice steady. The burly elder cracked his knuckles, a grim smile on his lips. West is mine. Giant nodded curtly. Move fast and don't engage longer than necessary. Leave no loose ends. Just like that, the fight in the city continued. Chapter 328. On the city. On the other hand, the mercenaries, still basking in the chaos they had created, suddenly found themselves under siege. The arrival of the Crimson Serpent sect elders shifted the tide in an instant. The disciplined ferocity of the disciples, now bolstered by the overwhelming strength of their leaders, transformed what had been a one-sided slaughter into a desperate fight for survival. Zirkel's group, stationed in the narrow streets of Thornridge, was the first to face the wrath of an elder. The wiry elder, his smirk gone and replaced with cold malice, descended upon them like a hawk on prey. His blade sang as it cleaved through the air, cutting down one of Zirkel's men in a single brutal strike. Fall back! Zirkel roared, his mismatched eyes narrowing as he hefted his axe. Regroup and retreat. The three remaining mercenaries with him moved to comply, their earlier confidence shattered. Zirkel swung his axe in a wide arc, the blade gleaming as it deflected a strike meant for his back. The elder pressed forward, his strikes relentless, and Zirkel gritted his teeth, knowing he couldn't hold him off for long. The elder sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. You dogs thought you could take on the Crimson Serpent sect? Pathetic. Zirkel's muscles burned as he parried another blow, his mind racing. He had faced strong opponents before, but this was different. The gap in power was undeniable. He could feel the weight of the elder's mana pressing against him, suffocating and absolute. Across the city, the other groups fared no better. In the Eastern District, a massive explosion of mana heralded the arrival of Elder Giant. Her silver-streaked hair shimmered as she moved with predatory grace, her blade cutting through the air like a whisper. A mercenary screamed as she bisected him cleanly, her movements precise and unyielding. Scatter! One of the mercenaries shouted, panic lacing his voice. But it was no use. Giant's strikes found their marks with terrifying accuracy, cutting down two more before the survivors could even think to flee. The remaining mercenary bolted down an alley, but Giant made no move to chase him. Instead, her cold gaze shifted to the next target zone, her movements deliberate as she left the corpses behind. In the Western District, chaos reigned as Elder Varos cut through a group of mercenaries like a storm of steel. His axe swung with terrifying power, cleaving through weapons and bodies alike. The streets ran red as the mercenaries tried to regroup, their cries of pain and desperation echoing through the narrow alleys. One of the mercenaries, a young man barely older than a boy, turned to run but was cut down by a vicious swing. Varos laughed, his booming voice reverberating through the night. Run, dogs. You'll only die tired. The coordinated attack that had once been the mercenaries' greatest strength now worked against them. With each group isolated and under assault, their numbers dwindled rapidly. The elders moved with ruthless efficiency, cutting off escape routes and forcing the mercenaries into desperate skirmishes where their inferior strength became painfully apparent. Zirkel, bloodied but unbowed, finally managed to pull his group into the cover of an abandoned building. He glanced at the two remaining mercenaries with him, their faces pale and their breaths ragged. We're splitting, he said grimly, his voice barely above a whisper. Stick to the shadows and head for the safe point. Don't stop for anything. What about you, boss? One of them asked, his voice shaking. Zirkel's mismatched eyes gleamed with determination. I'll keep them busy. Now move. The two mercenaries hesitated for a moment, then nodded and slipped into the shadows, their steps quiet but hurried. Zirkel turned back toward the sound of approaching footsteps, his axe hefted and ready. By the time the dust settled, the mercenaries' numbers had been halved. Out of the 20 who had started the assault, only 10 managed to escape the blood-soaked streets of Thornridge. The rest lay dead, their bodies scattered among the carnage they had wrought. The survivors regrouped in a hidden safe house on the outskirts of the city, their faces etched with exhaustion and grief. Zirkle arrived last, his axe dragging behind him and his mismatched eyes shadowed with guilt. "They got Jonas, didn't they?" one of the mercenaries asked quietly, his voice heavy. Zirkle nodded once, his jaw clenched. "Jonas, Riker, Valen. Too many." A heavy silence fell over the group as they processed the cost of their mission. For all the gold coins promised, for all the chaos they had unleashed, the price had been steep. The air in the safe house was thick with a mixture of blood, sweat, and quiet despair. The flickering light of a single lantern illuminated the haggard faces of the mercenaries who had survived the chaos. Each of them nursed wounds, some shallow, others deep, but the heaviest injuries weren't visible on their bodies. The weight of loss of comrades left behind hung in the room like a specter. Zirkle sat in a corner, his axe resting against the wall beside him. His mismatched eyes stared into the shadows, replaying the events of the night in his mind. The clashing of steel, the overwhelming presence of the elders, and the screams of his men as they fell. It all echoed relentlessly. "You will die if you are not nimble with your feet." Lucavion's voice surfaced in his thoughts, calm and matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather rather than planning an assault on a sect entrenched in power for decades. "That is why I'm giving you a day to make yourself familiar with the interior of the city, so that you can leave." He had meant it. Lucavion had given them time. Time to rest, time to learn the layout of Thornridge, and time to reconsider their choices. No one had been forced into this. They all knew the risks. They all understood that what they were attempting bordered on suicidal madness. But the money— Zirkle rubbed his face with a bloodied hand, the coins promised flickering like a cruel mirage in his mind. 1 gold coin for every kill. It was absurd, the kind of offer that no sane mercenary would trust. And yet, against all reason, they had believed him. Perhaps it wasn't just the money, Zirkle thought, his fingers tightening into a fist. Maybe it was something else. Something about Lucavion himself. The man wasn't like any employer Zirkle had ever worked for. He wasn't loud or boastful, didn't puff out his chest and bark orders like a noble who thought himself untouchable. Lucavion was calm, too calm, and beneath that calm was a quiet intensity, an unshakable conviction that made even the most skeptical mercenary pause. Zirkle sighed heavily, leaning his head back against the wall. "Ha! I'm really crazy," he muttered, his voice low but audible enough to draw the attention of one of the others. "Crazy?" one of the mercenaries echoed, a younger man with a deep cut across his arm. He gave a bitter laugh, his voice thick with exhaustion. "We all are, following that guy into this mess." "What were we thinking?" Another mercenary, a wiry woman with blood matted in her hair, shook her head. "We were thinking about the gold," she said bluntly. "And maybe, I don't know, maybe it's more than that. He's just different," Zirkle finished for her, his mismatched eyes flicking toward her. "Yeah, I've been trying to figure him out since we left. That guy, he's not normal. Not just strong, hell, we've seen plenty of strong people. But there's something about him. Something—" He paused, searching for the word. "Trustable," the younger man said, surprising them both. He shrugged when they looked at him. "I know it's stupid. Trust has no place in this line of work. But when he talks, it's like, I don't know, like he's already planned 10 steps ahead. Like he knows exactly how this ends, and we're just along for the ride." Zirkle snorted, his lips twisting into a wry smile. "Trustable, huh? For a guy who's probably more dangerous than anyone we've ever met." "Yeah, that sounds about right." He glanced around the room, taking in the exhausted faces of his remaining men. "But trust or not, we've got to make it through this. That bastard's not going to pay us if we don't survive. And I'll be damned if I let my share slip through my fingers." The wiry woman smirked faintly, though her eyes held a flicker of sadness. You really think we're making it out of this, boss? Zirkel's grin was sharp and bitter. We'd better. Or I'm dragging that crazy bastard down with me. The group fell into a tense silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the faint sounds of Thornridge's chaos still echoed through the night. Somewhere out there, Lucavion was moving, his calm confidence cutting through the storm he had unleashed. The eerie silence that followed the mercenaries' retreat gnawed at Elder Varos as he scanned the blood-soaked streets. His hulking frame was still, save for the faint rise and fall of his chest as he gripped his axe tightly. The lingering scent of blood and burning mana filled the air, but the enemies were gone. Rats, Varos growled, his deep voice reverberating through the empty street. They scurry away into their holes the moment they feel the heat. The wiry elder stepped beside him, his smirk returning, though it was tinged with frustration. Clever little pests, I'll give them that. But no matter how far they run, we'll find them. Nearby, Elder Giant arrived, her silver-streaked hair disheveled from the chase. Her blade was still drawn, but the tension in her posture revealed her frustration. Her two allies trailed behind her, their expressions grim. Heh! One would expect that one rat would be better at finding another. I guess that is not true. Chapter 329. What happened here? Heh! One would expect that one rat would be better at finding another. I guess that is not true. Giant's sharp gaze darted to Varos, and she didn't miss the smug grin creeping onto his face. You let them escape too, she said curtly, her voice edged with ice. I assume you're not here to gloat about a victory. Varos let out a booming laugh, his shoulders shaking with amusement. Let them escape? No, Giant. I was cleaning up your mess. His amber eyes gleamed with malice as he turned toward her fully. Though it's no surprise you'd let them slip through your fingers. After all, rats know their own kind. The insult struck hard, and Giant's composure cracked. She scoffed, her grip tightening on her blade. Careful, Varos. Your oversized ego might make you forget that you're no closer to catching them than I am. The wiry elder chuckled darkly, stepping closer to join Varos. Oh, we didn't lose them because of incompetence, dear Giant. Unlike you, we don't have a natural kinship with vermin. Maybe that's why they slip away when you're around. Giant's two allies bristled, their glares fixed on the original Crimson Serpent elders. The scarred elder stepped forward, his voice low and threatening. Watch your tongue, Varos, or I'll remind you why we're here in the first place. Varos turned his sharp gaze on him, his grin fading into a dangerous scowl. You think you can threaten me? You're here because you couldn't keep your own sect standing, and don't think I've forgotten that. The tension between the groups rose sharply, mana crackling faintly in the air as tempers flared. The crackling tension between the groups was interrupted when the wiry elder spoke up, his sharp tone cutting through the argument. Wait, don't you think it's strange? Varos turned to him, scowling. Strange? What are you babbling about now? The wiry elder ignored the irritation in Varos's voice, his smirk replaced by a thoughtful expression. These mercenaries wreaked havoc across the city, causing chaos left and right. But the moment we arrived, they scattered like rats. They didn't even try to fight back. Not in any meaningful way. Elder Giant, still simmering with frustration, narrowed her eyes. What's your point? They're cowards. They knew they couldn't stand against us. The wiry elder shook his head. No, that's not what I mean. If they knew we had strong elders like us, why would they even attack in the first place? With their measly strength, it's suicidal. Varos grunted, his grip tightening on his axe. Maybe they're just mad dogs. Who knows what rabble like that think? Giant's scarred ally stepped forward, his brow furrowed. Mad dogs don't fight with coordination like that. Did you see how they moved? How they isolated and struck specific targets? That wasn't random. They had a plan. The wiry elder snapped his fingers, nodding. Exactly. And yet, when we showed up, they didn't even attempt to resist. They ran, scattering into the night like their job was already done. Giant's gaze sharpened as the implication sank in. Stalling, she muttered, her voice low and cold. Varos stiffened, his amber eyes narrowing. "What are you suggesting?" Jian turned toward him, her composure regaining its edge. "If their goal wasn't to win, but to stall us, it changes everything. The chaos they caused, the scattered attacks, the retreats, it all makes sense if their main objective was somewhere else." The wiry elder crossed his arms, his expression contemplative. "Maybe they were after the warehouses," he said, glancing at the others. "It would make sense. They could be looking to steal supplies or trade goods. But even then, it feels off. The warehouses don't hold anything that valuable, at least not enough to warrant this kind of stunt." Elder Varos scowled, his grip tightening on the haft of his axe. "That's because the sect keeps all its valuable items in the armory beneath the main mansion. And no one in their right mind would even think of targeting that. Not with the patriarch there." Jian's silver-streaked hair glimmered as she tilted her head slightly, her sharp gaze fixed on Varos. "Exactly. The patriarch's strength is unmatched in this region. Even these mercenaries, reckless as they are, wouldn't dare attack the armory with him guarding it. It's suicide." The scarred elder nodded, his brow furrowing. "Then why? What's the point of all this chaos? They've lost too many people for this to be a simple raid." The wiry elder smirked faintly, though his tone lacked its usual bite. "Maybe they're just insane. Or maybe there's something we're missing." Jian's frustration was evident in the tightness of her jaw as she sheathed her blade. Whatever the case, their actions don't add up. If they were targeting the warehouses, we'd have caught them by now. If they had a larger plan, they wouldn't have retreated so easily. And yet, Varos cut her off with a growl, his amber eyes narrowing. "Enough speculation. We've wasted enough time chasing shadows. Let's return to the mansion and report to the patriarch. He'll know how to handle this." The wiry elder raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. "For once, I agree. The patriarch will want to hear about this." Whatever it was, Jian's lips thinned, her irritation barely concealed. "Fine. Let's regroup and report. But this isn't over. Something about this still doesn't sit right." The elders moved swiftly through the streets of Thornridge, their Qigong-enhanced steps carrying them over rooftops and through alleyways. The city was eerily quiet now, the chaos of the mercenaries' attack reduced to smoldering ruins and scattered corpses. The disciples they passed bowed low, their faces pale and shaken from the night's events. Just then, as they approached the towering gates of the Crimson Serpent sect's main mansion, a strange unease settled over them. The air felt heavy, charged with an unnatural energy. A metallic tang hung in the still night, faint at first but growing stronger with every step. "What the?" Varos growled, his senses sharpening. His grip tightened on his axe as his amber eyes scanned the darkness ahead. "Something's wrong." Jian slowed, her sharp gaze darting toward the source of the smell. Her voice was calm, but tension laced her words. "This smell. It's blood." The wiry elder's smirk vanished, his expression turning grim. "Not just blood. A lot of it." Without another word, the elders burst into motion, their Qigong movements carrying them swiftly through the gates and into the mansion's courtyard. The sight that greeted them stopped them in their tracks. Piles of corpses lay scattered across the courtyard, their crimson robes unmistakable. The disciples who had been left behind were now broken, lifeless forms. Blood pooled across the polished stone, glinting ominously under the faint moonlight. "What?" Varos breathed, his voice heavy with disbelief. His axe lowered slightly as his eyes swept over the scene. "How is this possible?" The scarred elder stepped forward, his jaw clenched tightly. This can't be real." These were the disciples guarding the mansion. Jian's silver-streaked hair shimmered as she moved cautiously toward the nearest pile of bodies, her expression icy and unreadable. Her blade was already drawn, its edge glinting in the faint light. "It's real," she said quietly. "Someone did this, and they did it with precision." Before anyone could respond, a sharp swoosh cut through the air. A black beam of light streaked across the courtyard, its speed blinding. It struck one of the elders square in the neck, piercing through his artery in a single, precise motion. Spurt. Blood erupted from the wound, spraying across the courtyard as the elder collapsed, clutching at his throat. His gasping breaths were drowned out by the sound of blood splattering against the cold stone. "What?" Varos roared, spinning around to locate the source of the attack. His eyes burned with fury as he raised his axe defensively. Jayan's blade was already in motion, her sharp gaze darting toward the direction of the beam. "Show yourself," she demanded, her voice echoing through the blood-soaked courtyard. A faint chuckle echoed through the air, low and mocking. The sound carried an unsettling calmness that sent a shiver down the spines of even the hardened elders. From the shadows of the courtyard, a figure emerged, his steps unhurried and deliberate. The man who revealed himself was tall and lean, his presence exuding an aura of quiet menace. His dark cloak billowed slightly in the faint wind, and his piercing eyes gleamed with an unnatural light. In his hand, he held a blade that shimmered with the faint glow of starlight, black and pulsating, as if alive. "Ho!" the man said, his voice smooth and mocking. "You've finally returned. I was beginning to think you'd abandoned your precious sect." His gaze swept over the elders, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "And here I thought I'd have to hunt you down myself," Varos growled, his amber eyes blazing with fury. "Who are you? What have you done here?" The man tilted his head slightly, his smirk widening. "Who am I? Fair question, but hardly relevant. What I've done, however—" He gestured casually toward the scattered corpses around him, his tone almost playful. "Well, that should be obvious, shouldn't it?" Jayan stepped forward, her blade gleaming with mana as her voice cut through the tension. "You're responsible for this massacre. Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" The man chuckled softly, his piercing gaze meeting hers. "Yup. Of course, know who am I dealing with. Do you think I would have come here if I didn't?" he said with his smirk wide. So you are the one named Jayan, the rat?" His eyes turned, his tone dripping with disdain. "Well, it is time to pay for the actions." Chapter 330. A Pity. Lucavion's smirk widened as his dark eyes swept over the remaining elders. The 5 figures stood tense, their weapons drawn and mana flaring in a futile attempt to mask their fear. The blood-soaked courtyard was silent except for the faint crackle of energy radiating from his blade. "Well," he drawled, his voice calm and laced with mockery, "it seems we've dwindled down to just 5. Pity. I was hoping for a more lively welcome." His gaze settled on the wiry elder, who stood rigid, his sharp features tight with wariness. Then it shifted to Varos, whose amber eyes blazed with fury, his grip on his axe white-knuckled. Finally, Lucavion turned his attention to Jayan and the 2 scarred elders beside her. His smirk faded, replaced by a cold, piercing stare. As he regarded them, Vital Yara's voice echoed in his mind, heavy with both sorrow and anger. "Lucavion, listen carefully. Jayan and the 2 with her, those are the traitors. They betrayed the Azure Blossom sect. They're the ones who sold us out to the Crimson Serpent sect." Lucavion's eyes flickered with understanding, though his expression remained unreadable. "And the others?" he asked silently. "Varos and the wiry elder." Vital Yara's voice softened slightly, though it still carried an edge of disdain. "They were once part of the Crimson Serpent sect's original leadership. They may be cruel, but their loyalty lies within their own twisted sense of order. The true corruption, the betrayal, rests with Jayan and her allies." Her tone grew harsher, trembling with suppressed fury. "Jayan, that girl. I gave her everything. My fire of life, my guidance, my protection. I saw potential in her, potential to grow, to lead. And she repaid me with treachery. She didn't just betray the sect. She betrayed me." Lucavion tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes locking onto Jayan. Her silver-streaked hair glinted faintly in the moonlight, but her composed facade was cracking under the weight of his gaze. "You," he said, his voice sharp and unyielding, "must be Jayan." Jayan stiffened, her blade twitching in her grip. "What of it?" she snapped, her tone defiant, though a flicker of unease crossed her face. Lucavion chuckled softly, the sound devoid of warmth. I heard you were quite the prodigy. A disciple with untapped potential, nurtured and protected by a certain someone. Jayan's eyes narrowed, her knuckles tightening around her blade. I don't know what you're talking about, she said tersely. Lucavion stepped closer, the glow of his blade illuminating his face in the dim light. Don't you, he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. You had a guardian once, a protector who saw something in you worth saving. And you betrayed her. Jayan flinched, her composure slipping further. The two scarred elders at her side exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence faltering. Varos growled, stepping forward with his axe raised. Enough of this. If you've come to kill us, then stop your games and face us. Lucavion didn't even spare him a glance. His focus remained on Jayan, his smirk widening as her defiance crumbled under his unrelenting gaze. You're right, he said softly, his tone chilling. It's time to pay for your actions. He moved in an instant, his blade a blur of black starlight. The scarred elder to Jayan's left barely had time to react before the estoc pierced his heart with precision. Blood spurted from the wound, and the man collapsed with a strangled gasp. Jayan let out a sharp cry, her blade flashing as she lunged at Lucavion. But he sidestepped easily, his movements fluid and deliberate. You're quick to strike, he remarked, his voice calm. But I wonder if you're quick enough to save yourself. The remaining elders exploded into action, mana flaring as they charged. Varos's axe swung with deadly force, but Lucavion met it with his estoc, the clash of metal ringing through the courtyard. The wiry elder circled behind him, attempting a flanking strike, but Vital Yara's glowing form leapt from Lucavion's shoulder, intercepting with a flash of celestial fire. Jayan shouted orders, her voice sharp with desperation. Focus on him. Take him down. She was cut off as Lucavion's blade whirled toward her, forcing her back with a calculated strike. He smiled coldly, his eyes gleaming with dark amusement. You betrayed your guardian, your sect, your people. Do you think you're worthy of giving orders now? Jayan's silver-streaked hair whipped around her face as she snarled, her blade igniting with a burst of mana. I don't need your judgment, she spat. You don't know anything about me. Lucavion's smirk faded, his gaze hardening. I know enough, he said simply, his voice cutting like a blade. And with that, he pressed the attack. Lucavion raised his head, his smirk widening as his dark eyes flickered with a dangerous gleam. The five elders surged toward him, their mana flaring in a chaotic symphony of colors and energies. But Lucavion remained unfazed, his confidence palpable as he raised his estoc. Swoosh! The blade glowed with a black starlight that pulsed with eerie vitality, as though it drew power from the very fabric of the cosmos. Simultaneously, his other hand ignited with a brilliant black and orange flame, the signature of his flame of Equinox core. The heat radiating from his hand was oppressive, twisting the air around him into distorted waves. What is this? How can he have two different elements? Artifact. Heh, just because you have an artifact. Jayan spat, her voice laced with both anger and disbelief. Do you think that makes you untouchable? Lucavion chuckled, the sound low and mocking. It doesn't just make me untouchable, he said, his tone sharp with finality. It makes you irrelevant. He surged forward, his blade flashing with starlight as he met Varos's incoming axe head-on. Swoosh! Varos brought his axe down with a roar, its massive weight fueled by a fiery crimson mana. But Lucavion's estoc, enhanced by his Devourer of Stars core, intercepted the strike with a resounding clang. The energy coursing through the blade absorbed the impact, deflecting the axe with a burst of shimmering black light. In the same motion, Lucavion's flame-clad hand thrust outward, releasing a jet of searing fire toward the wiry elder who had been circling him. The man let out a startled cry as he dodged to the side, the flames scorching the edge of his robes. You'll have to do better than that, Lucavion said, his voice dripping with disdain as he twisted his body to avoid a thrust from Jayan. Her blade missed by a hair's breadth, and Lucavion countered with a precise thrust of his own, forcing her to leap back. Lucavion's movements were a blur of precision and chaos. Void Starfall Blade. Eclipse Star Trail. Swoosh! In an instant, his estoc darted like a serpent, piercing through the defense of the scarred elder on Giant's right. Stab! The blade struck true, black starlight surging through the man's body as he collapsed with a strangled gasp. At the same time, with his flame-clad hand, Lucavion released a wave of fire toward the wiry elder. The black-white flames consumed the space between them, forcing the elder to retreat with a desperate shield of mana. Swoosh! Varos's axe came swinging again, but Lucavion sidestepped with unnerving grace, using the opening to lash out with his blade. The edge of the estoc skimmed Varos's side, drawing a thin line of blood and eliciting a growl of pain. The three remaining elders regrouped, their mana pooling together as they prepared a coordinated assault. Giant's voice rang out, commanding the others. Surround him. Don't let him control the space. Just wait until the Patriarch comes out. Lucavion laughed, the sound dark and unhinged. Control the space? He repeated, mockingly. It's mine already. The elders attacked in unison. Giant lunged forward with her mana-infused blade, her silver-streaked hair whipping around her face. Varos came from the side, his axe blazing with renewed fervor as he swung with crushing force. The wiry elder aimed a spear-like projection of mana directly at Lucavion's core. Lucavion's response was seamless. Swoosh! He raised his estoc, its black starlight flaring brighter than ever. Void Starfall Blade. Starlight Needle. The blade danced through the air, parrying Giant's strike and redirecting her momentum into Varos's path. Flame of Equinox. Blast of Death. At the same time, his flame-clad hand surged with power. He thrust it outward, a concentrated burst of fire obliterating the wiry elder's mana projection and forcing him to stumble back. Finally, Lucavion pivoted, his estoc slicing downward in an arc of destructive starlight that struck Varos's axe mid-swing. The weapon shattered under the force, sending shards of molten metal flying. Clank! Enough! Giant roared, her mana flaring wildly as she unleashed her aura. The energy of a peak 3-star surged forward as she rushed. Giant surged forward, her blade trailing brilliant arcs of azure mana as her technique ignited the battlefield. The energy coiled and pulsed like living vines, a hallmark of the azure blossom sex, blooming petal slash. A series of rapid, unpredictable strikes that overwhelmed opponents with speed and precision. Lucavion's smirk widened as he stood his ground, his estoc raised in a loose, unhurried grip. He could sense it, the faint but unmistakable traces of Vital Yara's presence lingering in the technique. The irony was delicious. Using the technique of the sect you betrayed, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. As expected of a rat, he was smiling still.
Hello everyone. We now have a Discord server. Join us for faster updates, discussions about your favorite novels, and exclusive Discord-only content. Don't miss out. See you there. Scan the QR code on the screen or enter any of the displayed links into your browser to join our Discord.